In 1996, a Texas woman named Darlie Routier would be charged with the murder of her two sons. They'd been found stabbed to death with a kitchen knife after Routier made a call to police claiming she'd woken up to an intruder in her home who'd killed her children. Darlie herself was wounded in the throat and arm, but her wounds were described by medical experts as superficial and possibly self-inflicted. But there's more to this already wild case than you think. Not everyone agrees with the DA's findings, and this case continues to embattle the public and legal scholars alike. Well, let's find out why. I'm Jason, and this is Killer Bites. People have asked a lot of questions about the jury's verdict over the past 25 years, and even Routier's ex-husband believes she's been telling the truth. Was a loving, dedicated mother wrongly convicted of this heinous crime? Let's take a bite. Darren and Darlie Routier were called the Ozzie and Harriet of the 90s by others in their community. They were even the neighborhood's Beverly Hillbillies. Darren had founded a company that tested electronic components, and the young couple weren't bashful about the success he'd found in business. They were both very fond of diamond jewelry. But they were also generous enough to help a neighbor pay his house payments after he was diagnosed with cancer. But in 1996, Darren's business had slowed, and the couple had racked up over $20,000 of credit card debt and back mortgage payments. On June 6th at 2:30 a.m., Dallas Emergency Dispatch received a call from the east side of the city. On this call, Darlie Routier told police an intruder had broken in and stabbed her and two of her sons.
911, what is your emergency? Ma'am? What? Who did? Hang on.
When the police arrived 3 minutes later, she said she didn't know whether the intruder was still around or not, so paramedics were barred from carrying out life-saving procedures on her children until the threat of danger was resolved. But with an assailant nowhere to be found, paramedics would arrive too late, and the police took Darlie's testimony about her children's deaths. She described being awoken by her son Damon crying for her in the middle of the night. In the dark, she hadn't noticed she was injured, but had already apparently been attacked in her sleep. She saw a man running out of the house through the kitchen and followed him to the garage, where she saw a knife and picked it up. But then she turned back and found Damon and Devin severely injured, and only then discovered she'd also been stabbed. Darlie's husband Darren had been asleep upstairs with their infant son Drake and rushed down at the time when Darlie started screaming. Darren attempted CPR on their sons, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late to save their lives. There was a search for this unknown assailant, but the story Darlie told police was already pretty wild. Of course, nobody knows how they would react if they've never been in a situation like the one Darlie described, but she really told them she'd been stabbed in her sleep and didn't realize it because the lights weren't on. I don't know, I wouldn't have the guts to say that if it wasn't true, so maybe she wasn't lying? Nonetheless, medical examiners described Darlie's injuries as superficial, especially compared to those of the boys. But her throat was cut within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. However, there was no evidence of a stabbing or blood where she'd been sleeping. Well, my attention instantly piqued when she included the detail about picking up the murder weapon. Now, it seems minor, but it explains why her fingerprints or DNA might be on the knife that was used to murder her two sons. It's also her house, so would it be that surprising to find? The order of events in her story doesn't make a lot of common sense. Now, what investigators did find compelling was the limited forensic evidence at the scene, which appeared staged. A cut had been made in the screen of the Routier's kitchen window. This was supposed to be the mysterious assailant's point of entrance. But upon further inspection, there were no fabric tears or marks near the window apart from a fingerprint. That print belonged to Darlie, and investigators also found what they described as a microscopic fiber from the windowsill on a butter knife in the cupboard. Invisible evidence is not the norm in most criminal cases, but the state in fact said that there was enough dust on the bottom of the window panes for them to confirm that nobody had ever climbed through that window recently at all. Neither the garage nor the rest of the house contained any blood, footprints, or forensic evidence of any kind in the home from anyone besides the Routiers. Darlie's clothes did, of course, have blood on them, but experts corroborated that the spatter trails found on them were consistent with Darlie being the one who attacked her children, not a struggle with a third-party assailant. None of the home's valuables had been stolen, even when a jar full of gold and diamond jewelry that Darlie kept in the kitchen was out for any burglars to see. The only thing found outside the home was one sock with Damon's blood on it. This strange piece of evidence was discovered 3 houses down from the Routiers' home. It belonged to Darren, but no forensic evidence besides Damon's blood was found on it. To police, Darlie was the prime suspect, but they were still searching for a clear motive despite the family's financial situation. The timeline of their narrative was also imperfect, as there was only about a 5-minute interval between the beginning of Darlie's 911 call and the arrival of the first officer on the scene. Paramedics arrived a couple minutes later. Now, this is important because Damon was still alive when they got there, and though they couldn't save his life, medical examiners evaluated that his death must have taken at most only 9 minutes from the moment he was attacked. So, do you think that's enough time for Darlie Routier to stage the scene for Darren and police before Damon's death, including running outside to plant a sock down the street? Well, I'm not sure, but that question and others have opened up more than one person's mind to the possibility that the prosecution was misrepresenting evidence to suit their narrative. Prosecutors only addressed this complication in the timeline by discrediting the medical examiner's estimate of the time frame. I mean, after all, it was only an estimate. But whether Darren and Darlie Routier were Ozzie and Harriet behind closed doors or not, Darlie had become the Casey Anthony of the 90s. Opinions on Casey Anthony's infamous filicide case have been mixed by missing witnesses, confused motives, and character bashing in the media. And Darlie Routier's case didn't escape the same controversies. Devin's 7th birthday would come only days after the attack. Even with him gone, the family still held the ceremony, and they decided to do it at his gravesite. Attendees report that the family gathering began with a solemn ceremony, but it ended with a celebration at his grave, where Darlie was recorded dancing and spraying silly string on her son's freshly placed tombstones. Well, long story short, the optics weren't exactly what everyone expected to see from a grieving mother. Her family has always come to Darlie's defense, describing her behavior as that of a mother in shock at having to grieve the brutal murder of her oldest children. But in the video clip, Darlie celebrates over her son's grave with a smile on her face. And to many, it just doesn't look right. This video would become a key in the prosecution's case against Darlie's character, since the only motive they would find was the boy's $20,000 life insurance policy. The prosecution described her dancing on her son's graves to jurors and wove a narrative out of circumstantial evidence that accused Routier of killing her 5- and 6-year-old boys to alleviate the family's financial woes, and this story had a big influence at the outcome of the trial. Despite the defense's claim that her husband's $800,000 life insurance policy would be a much more logical financial motive for murder, the forensic evidence supported by expert medical testimony were satisfactory to jurors. They agreed that the darkest conclusion was the truth and sentenced her to death by lethal injection in Kerrville, Texas, for her son Damon's murder. Though she was charged for both murders, she was only convicted on Damon's to avoid falling into an entanglement with double jeopardy laws in the case her second trial turned out differently. But Darlie Routier maintains her innocence from death row. For the past 20 years, her family has visited often, and she spent her first decade in prison reading the Harry Potter series along with her last remaining son. After her trial, her husband Darren got a tattoo of her and their 3 sons' faces on his arm, fully supportive of his wife's innocence. Darlie sticks to a regimented workout routine, still receives a monthly copy of Parenting magazine, and says she wonders from her prison cell how something like this could have happened to her. 3 true crime paperbacks, and over 20 years later, the narrative that Darlie is another mother who lost it might have been the last word for those who moved on to the next headline. However, Darlie Routier's new defense team believes that she wasn't asleep during her attack, and it's more likely that the trauma of being nearly murdered in her own home and finding her 2 sons' corpses left a scar on her memory. which repressed the first part of the incident when she gave her first initial statements. Her defense has since found their own experts who've testified to the possibility that Darlie's wounds indeed could have come from an attacker, and a juror from her own trial even said that he and the other jurors have made the wrong decision. Darlie Routier's family even got a hold of Texas millionaire Brian Pardo, who's made a reputation of fighting for appeals on behalf of the wrongly convicted. At an estimated expenditure of over $100,000 of his own, he carried out an independent investigation of the evidence in Darlie's case, in which developed its own findings. Brian claims that the police were correct in suspecting an effort to stage the scene as a robbery, but that they didn't spend enough time looking into Darren's role in the case. With Brian Pardo's help, Darlie's defense boasts an affidavit from her husband that he had inquired after paying someone to stage a break-in theft of their home in the months before the murders. He claimed it was a misadventure at filing a fraudulent claim on the family's home insurance policy to relieve the financial pressure his business was suffering from. Well, Darren also agreed to a lie detector test during Brian Pardo's investigation. This lie detector test resulted in evidence of dishonesty when Darren denied playing a role in the home invasion attack and stabbing Darlie himself. He failed 2 more lie detector tests, and the results looked so bad that the test examiner tried to extract a confession from him after the final test personally. But like Darlie, Darren Routier has always maintained his innocence. Brian Pardo's mind is nonetheless made up that Darlie's husband is a sociopathic murderer. Darlie told Pardo that she had asked Darren for a separation the day of the murders, but he had threatened himself and her with a gun, and they both just ended up in hysterics before moving on. So Pardo believes that Darren is the one with a financial motive, and he conspired to murder all 3 of them with an accomplice that night. Forensic photographs showcasing defensive wounds on Darlie's wrists a few days after the attack that weren't admitted as evidence have changed some people's minds too. But medical professionals reviewing the evidence for the court agreed at the time that the marks weren't there the night of the attack. They only appeared days after Darlie was released from the hospital. The defense's other substantiating evidence depends upon the results of a rogue fingerprint found at the scene that was deemed too small to be a conclusive match with anyone. State experts also disagree on its relevance to the case, stating on record that it appeared to belong to one of the children. But Darlie's appellate defense still wants to rule out the possibility that the fingerprint was that of a child's, and has lobbied the courts to allow the new evidence in the case, even going as far as exhuming the boys' corpses to test them for fingerprints. But lie detector results cannot be admitted as evidence in court, and the boys' remains were no longer in a state fit for testing. Though judges had new questions about the prosecution's representation of evidence during the trial, none of Darlie's new evidence had been allowed into her appeals cases. Darren, on the other hand, still insists that he never carried out any insurance fraud plans he had, and state prosecutors claim Brian Pardo's findings still don't explain why a third-party intruder would simply commit murder in the home and not take any of the jewelry on the Routier's counter. So to this day, motives and ulterior motives continue to fog this case. The district attorney and investigators are content they've brought the boys justice, and no appeals have been granted to Darlie Routier, who still awaits her execution on death row. But between Darlie and Darren's mental health, their attachments to their wealthy lifestyle, their picture-perfect family life, and the way it ended up, there are so many contradictory details to keep track of here. And with all the questions and possible scenarios in this case, what evidence do you believe the most? I don't know for sure, but the scariest question I have at this point is, how well can you really know the person you marry? So what do you think? Do you think it was Darlie? Possibly Darren? A third-party intruder? Let me know in the comments what you think is going on here. I'm Jason, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.